You're back. And today you're not walking into a throne room or a battlefield. You're walking into fire. It's before dawn in a great stone castle somewhere in the English countryside, sometime in the 1300s, and the kitchens are already roaring. Men stripped to the waist despite the cold, sweat running down blackened skin, hauling sides of beef the size of a grown man toward a hearth wide enough to walk into standing up. Somewhere above, in the hall, the household still sleeps. They have no idea what it costs, every single morning, to feed them. Today, using AI-recreated imagery, historic paintings, and archaeological reconstructions of surviving castle kitchens across Britain and Europe, we're going to step inside that heat, that noise, and that danger and understand why the kitchen, not the dungeon, not the battlefield, was quietly one of the most brutal places to work in the entire medieval world. And by the end, we'll walk through what remains of these rooms today. Blackened stone and empty hearths where an entire invisible workforce once kept a kingdom fed. Long before castles had kitchens like this, they barely had kitchens at all. In the earliest Norman strongholds, cooking happened wherever it could. A fire pit in the bailey, a lean-to shed, sometimes nothing more than a hearth in the corner of the hall itself, smoke curling up past the lord's own table. Nobody building those first timber motte and bailey forts was thinking about cuisine. They were thinking about survival, about walls tall enough to keep out raiders, about a roof that wouldn't collapse in a siege. Food was fuel, cooked fast and eaten fast, by soldiers and laborers who had no idea that within a few generations, the humble fire pit outside their hall would evolve into an engineering marvel of stone flues, multiple hearths, and a workforce numbering in the dozens. Nobody in that muddy bailey imagined their descendants would build rooms specifically, obsessively, designed around the act of cooking for hundreds of people at once, and that those rooms would become some of the most physically punishing workplaces of the entire medieval age. By the height of castle culture, somewhere between the 1200s and the 1400s, the kitchen had become its own architectural beast. Picture a room sometimes 40 feet across, with a ceiling soaring 20, even 30 feet overhead, built that high for one brutal reason: to give smoke somewhere to go before it choked everyone working below. The hearths themselves could be enormous, 6 or 8 feet wide, deep enough to roast an entire ox on an iron spit turned by hand for hours at a stretch. The walls were often stone specifically because timber simply could not survive the heat and the risk of fire day after day, year after year. Multiple fires might burn simultaneously in the same room, one for roasting, one for boiling in vast iron cauldrons, another for baking in a beehive-shaped bread oven built directly into the wall. The floor was typically stone or packed earth, slick with grease, blood, and spilled fat that no amount of scrubbing ever fully lifted. And this was never a finished, static space. Castle accounts from the period repeatedly mention repairs to chimneys, to cracked ovens, to roofing damaged by the very smoke and heat the kitchen produced. A great kitchen was never simply built and left alone. It was constantly being patched, rebuilt, and argued over by stewards trying to keep it from literally falling apart under the strain of its own purpose. Feeding a castle was not simply a matter of appetite. It was a matter of order, hierarchy, and even faith. Above the kitchen, quite literally in status if not always in architecture, sat the Great Hall, where meals were staged almost like theater, with seating position broadcasting exactly where you stood in the household's pecking order. Grace was said before meals, often by a chaplain, tying the daily bread on the table back to the household's spiritual life. Below that hall, in the kitchen and its surrounding offices, the pantry for bread, the buttery for drink, the larder for meat, the spicery for costly imported flavorings. A whole civic system operated with its own laws. The steward oversaw the household's finances and discipline. The clerk of the kitchen logged every joint of meat, every sack of flour, every barrel of wine, because theft and waste could quietly bankrupt a noble estate. Religious calendars dictated the rhythm of the kitchen as much as any lord's preference. Fish days, fasting days, and feast days each demanded an entirely different rhythm of work, and a good cook had to know the liturgical calendar as well as any priest, because serving meat on a fast day was not just a mistake, it was a small scandal. Now walk with me through what a normal working day actually felt like for the dozens of people who kept this machine running. Long before sunrise, scullions, often boys as young as 8 or 9, the lowest and youngest workers in the entire household, were already awake, hauling water from wells or rivers in heavy wooden buckets, feeding fires that had likely never fully gone out overnight. The heat near the hearths could be genuinely dangerous, roasting cook's skin red even in the depths of winter, while workers stationed farther from the fire, plucking birds or scrubbing pots in stone sculleries, might be shivering in near-freezing drafts just a few yards away. Noise was constant. The clang of iron cauldrons, the hiss and spit of fat dropping onto open flame, dogs turning spit wheels and treadmills built into the wall, shouted orders bouncing off stone that only amplified every sound. Smells layered on top of each other in ways that would overwhelm a modern nose. Roasting meat, wood smoke, boiling cabbage, spilled ale, and underneath it all, the sourer smell of offal and grease that never quite left the stone. A large noble household might employ anywhere from 20 to over 100 people just to keep meals flowing, a small, sweating city hidden behind the castle's grander public rooms, and every single one of them, from the youngest scullion to the head cook, understood that a mistake here could mean burns, scalds, crushed fingers, or worse. If the kitchen was the brutal engine room, the Great Hall was the stage where the castle's public identity was performed, and one feast could define a lord's reputation for years. Chroniclers recorded feasts with hundreds of guests and courses stretching into the dozens. Roasted peacocks redressed in their own feathers for dramatic presentation, elaborate sugar sculptures called subtleties shaped like castles or ships, and enough wine and ale to fill entire cellars. These events were not simply about food. They were political theater, alliances sealed and rivalries displayed over a shared table, and a poorly executed feast could genuinely damage a noble family's standing among their peers. Behind every one of those glittering, celebrated evenings stood a kitchen crew who had been working for days, sometimes weeks, in conditions of exhausting heat and pressure that the well-dressed guests upstairs would never see and never think to ask about. And while the workers below sweated over open flame, the family who owned the castle lived an entirely different life just steps away. In the private chambers of a lord and lady, walls might be hung with imported tapestries, dyed a deep, expensive blue or red that servants' clothing could never afford. Furniture was carved oak, sometimes gilded. Window glass, where it existed at all, was a luxury few outside the nobility ever touched. Meals in these private quarters could include spices carried thousands of miles. Pepper, cinnamon, saffron, worth more by weight than silver, each pinch representing enormous cost and enormous distance traveled. It's tempting to imagine this privileged world as insulated and untouchable, but it never truly was. The same fires that fed their table could just as easily consume their home. The same politics that funded their luxury could, in a single bad season, a single failed harvest, a single lost battle, turn triumph into ruin. Whatever hardship or disaster was coming for a castle rarely stopped politely at the kitchen door. And disaster eventually always did come, though rarely as one single dramatic moment. For most castle kitchens, the true turning point wasn't fire or siege, though both happened often enough to fill chronicles with warnings about kitchen blazes getting out of control. The real turning point was slower and, in its way, more final, the gradual collapse of the entire world these kitchens were built to serve. Across the 1400s and into the 1500s, the rise of gunpowder artillery made thick stone castle walls increasingly indefensible, and the feudal structure that required a lord to house, feed, and command dozens of armed retainers within a single fortified household slowly gave way to different systems of power and different kinds of homes. Many great kitchens weren't destroyed in some dramatic single event. They were simply abandoned, piece by piece, as castles themselves fell out of military and social relevance, their vast hearths cooling for the final time as households moved to smaller, more comfortable manor houses better suited to a changing age. In the moment, the people living through this shift likely didn't experience it as an ending at all, just a slow, uneven drift, one generation building a manor house instead of reinforcing an old keep, one kitchen crew smaller than the one before it, until eventually the fires simply weren't relit. In the centuries that followed, many of these great kitchens sat cold and empty, their roofs eventually collapsing, their stones scavenged by local builders for other projects, their function forgotten by anyone who hadn't lived it. Some castles crumbled into picturesque ruin, ivy climbing walls that once radiated heat you could feel from the doorway. Others were absorbed into later buildings, their original hearths bricked over or buried beneath newer floors, silent and unknown for generations. The people who had worked those brutal, exhausting shifts left almost no personal record behind. Scullions and undercooks rarely wrote anything down, and history, for centuries, remembered the feast far better than it remembered the hands that made it possible. It was really only with the rise of modern archaeology and architectural history that these spaces were properly rediscovered and understood. Excavations and detailed surveys at surviving medieval castles have uncovered soot-blackened flues, worn stone thresholds polished smooth by generations of running feet, and fragments of cooking equipment, cauldron legs, spit supports, and shattered pottery that quietly confirm just how intense and constant the activity here once was. What struck historians studying these rooms wasn't the grandeur, since kitchens were rarely built to impress, but the sheer scale of daily human effort the architecture implied. Room after room engineered purely around heat, smoke, and relentless, repetitive labor. It's worth pausing here just for a moment on what all of this really represents. Behind every roasted peacock and gilded feast in medieval history stood ordinary people, mostly nameless to us now, who spent their lives in heat and smoke so that others could eat well and be remembered. These weren't grand halls built for glory. They were workplaces, and the people who filled them deserved to be remembered as more than a footnote to someone else's banquet. Today, if you visit some of the great surviving medieval castles of Britain and Europe, you can often still walk directly into these kitchens, and the change from the noble apartments is immediate and physical. At places like Stokesay Castle or the great kitchens preserved within sites such as Raby and Chepstow, you'll find enormous stone hearths still standing empty, chimney flues you can look straight up through toward daylight, and floors worn uneven by centuries of foot traffic. Some kitchens have been carefully restored with replica cauldrons and spits so visitors can picture the fires that once burned there. Others remain simply as empty stone shells, roofless, open to the sky, their scale alone still enough to hint at what once filled them. Meanwhile, the halls these kitchens once fed often survive in far better condition, restored with furniture, tapestries, and interpretation panels, a quiet, visible reminder of whose comfort this whole brutal machine was built to serve. Standing in one of these cold hearths today, it's genuinely hard not to feel the ghost of that heat, that noise, and that exhausting, unglamorous labor that once filled the space around you. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today, walking through fire that went cold centuries ago. If there's a place, a ruin, or a piece of history you'd love to see brought back to life like this, drop it in the comments below. I read every single one and genuinely love hearing your ideas for where we should go next. I'll see you again very soon.